Along the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, on a narrow strip of coast pressed between mountains and sea, there was a people who never called themselves what history remembers them by. To the Greeks, they were the Phoenicians, the purple people, named for the dye that stained their hands and made their cities wealthy. To themselves, they were Canaanites, or more often, simply people of their city. A man of Tyre, a woman of Sidon, a merchant of Byblos. And these cities, small independent kingdoms strung along about 100 miles of coastline, would over the course of 1,000 years quietly reshape the ancient world in ways that their neighbors, then and now, have never quite given them credit for. They were not empire builders in the conventional sense. They didn't conquer vast territories. They didn't leave behind pyramids or ziggurats or great libraries carved into cliff faces. The cedarwood palaces of their kings have rotted away entirely, and the archives that must have existed in their scribal halls have all been lost with them. But what they did leave, well, that legacy is more consequential than anything that Egypt or Assyria managed. Because sometime around the 11th century BC, in a workshop or a merchant's counting house or a scribe's cramped little room, someone among them worked out something extraordinary. 22 little symbols. 22 signs, each one standing for a single sound. And with that, the alphabet was born. The very characters you're reading now, filtered down through Greek and Latin and English, all trace their ancestry back to marks that Phoenician traders scratched onto pottery and papyrus 3,000 years ago. So tonight's a video about who these people were, where they came from, and how a handful of coastal cities managed to teach the world how to write. It's also a story about the sea. About purple dye and cedar wood and glass. About the founding of Carthage and the destruction of Tyre. About being conquered and reconquered, and yet somehow, culturally, refusing to disappear. Come with me and we'll walk through the streets of Sidon while the murex shells are being boiled, and we'll stand at the harbour of Tyre while Alexander builds his causeway. Welcome to the channel. First, though, just quickly, thank you to those of you supporting the channel financially, keeping us ad-free, sponsor-free, and beholden to nobody besides you good people of the audience. If you'd like to join the ranks of those very fine supporters, check out the pinned comment and the video description. And if that's not something you can do, well, giving the video a like, dropping a comment, subscribing if you haven't already, that always helps push us out in the algorithm. It really does help, so I do appreciate it. Right, let's begin. Let's start with the geography, because with the Phoenicians, geography really is destiny. The strip of land we're talking about corresponds roughly to modern Lebanon, along with the coastal edges of what's now Syria to the north and Israel to the south. It's a narrow country. In some places, no more than 15 or 20 miles from the shoreline to the crest of the mountains that run parallel to the sea. And those mountains, the Lebanon Range, they cut this coast off from the interior in a way that's easy to underestimate when you're just looking at a modern map. To go inland was a serious journey, over passes that were snowbound in winter and down into the valleys of Syria beyond. To go by sea, on the other hand, well, the sea was right there. Wide open, predictable in its winds, studded with islands and with other coasts that a decent ship could reach in days or weeks. So the Phoenicians turned toward the water, which is what any sensible people would do if you plopped them down in a place like that. The specific cities that emerged along this coast, from north to south, were Arwad, Byblos, Berytus, which is modern Beirut, Sidon, and Tyre. There were smaller settlements too, dozens of them, but those 5 were the important ones. And of them, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre were the ones that mattered most in the Phoenician story. Each was independent. Each had its own king, its own gods, its own particular commercial specialties. They cooperated when it suited them. They competed when it suited them. They never, so far as we can tell, formed a unified state, and that's actually an important point to hold on to. There was no Phoenician empire. There was no Phoenician king of kings. There were only cities doing what cities do, which is trying to get rich and stay alive. Now the origins of these people are a little bit tangled, and the honest answer is that scholars still argue about it. The dominant view is that the Phoenicians were, essentially, Canaanites who happened to live on the coast. Canaanite being a broad Semitic-speaking cultural group that occupied the whole of the Levant in the 2nd millennium BC, and whose various tribes and city-states included the ancestors of the later Hebrews, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and various other peoples who turn up in the biblical record. In genetic and linguistic terms, the Phoenicians were part of that Canaanite continuum. Their language is what linguists sometimes call Phoenician, but it's really just a dialect of Canaanite. And their gods, Baal and Astarte and El and Melkart, are the same gods, with regional variations that were worshipped across the broader Canaanite world. What made the coastal Canaanites distinctive, what turned them into what we call Phoenicians, was the maritime turn. Sometime in the late Bronze Age, roughly the 15th and 14th centuries BC, the cities of the Levant and coast began to specialize in seaborne trade in a way that their inland cousins really didn't. Byblos was already, by then, deeply involved in the export of cedar wood to Egypt. The famous cedars of Lebanon, which biblical writers would later celebrate at some length, were being cut and shipped south to Egyptian construction projects for centuries before the Phoenicians, as we usually think of them, ever really emerged as a distinct entity. The Egyptian records preserve the correspondence. In the archive at Tel El Amarna, which was the short-lived capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BC, there are letters from the kings of Byblos to the pharaoh, written in Akkadian, which was the diplomatic language of the age. These letters are complaining, often, about political troubles in their region and asking for Egyptian support. And they show us a city already deeply enmeshed in international politics and international trade, a full 3 centuries before the Phoenician Golden Age would really begin. Well then, what happened to turn coastal Canaanites into the Phoenicians of history? The short answer is the late Bronze Age collapse, and this is a subject we've covered in some depth on this channel before. Very briefly, though, sometime around 1200 BC, the interconnected civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittite Empire, the Mycenaean Greek palaces, the Egyptian New Kingdom, the Kassite Babylonians, all suffered a series of catastrophic disruptions that basically dissolved the international order that had existed for centuries. Cities were burned, trade routes collapsed, populations moved. The mysterious sea peoples, whoever exactly they were, showed up along the coasts of Egypt and the Levant, and the whole system, as they say, came apart at the seams. Now the Phoenician cities were not entirely spared this catastrophe. There's evidence of destruction at some of them, particularly further south, but they came through it better than most. And crucially, when the dust settled, and the great powers of the previous age were either gone entirely or badly weakened, the Phoenician cities found themselves in an extraordinary position. The competition, so to speak, had been eliminated. Egypt was diminished, focused inward, no longer projecting power northward the way it had. The Hittites were gone. The Mycenaean Greeks had collapsed into a dark age of their own. And the Eastern Mediterranean, which had been a busy sea full of rival merchant fleets, was suddenly wide open. If you were a coastal Canaanite city with intact harbors, intact shipbuilding traditions, and intact commercial networks, well, the world was your oyster. Or in this case, the world was your murex snail. And that's when they really begin, in the historical sense. The 11th and 10th centuries BC are when the Phoenicians moved from being one Levantan coastal culture among several to being the dominant maritime civilization of the Mediterranean. Their ships fanned out to Cyprus, to Crete, to the Aegean Islands. They pushed westward along the North African coast, along the southern coast of Anatolia, into the Adriatic, and eventually all the way to the Western Mediterranean. They founded trading posts and colonies. They developed relationships with local populations for the extraction of raw materials: tin from what's now Cornwall in Britain, copper from Sardinia, silver from Iberia. And in doing all of this, over about 500 years, they knit the whole Mediterranean world together into a single commercial system for the first time in history. The specific commodities that made the Phoenicians rich are worth pausing on for a moment because they help explain the character of the civilization. The most famous, obviously, is the purple dye, the Tyrian purple, which gave them their Greek name. This dye was extracted from the murex snail, several species of small sea creatures that lived in the shallow waters of the Levantan coast, and whose secretions, when properly processed, produced a range of colors from deep red to violet to a rich, saturated purple that was, for reasons of chemistry, extraordinarily color-fast, meaning that once fabric was dyed with it, it didn't really fade. And in an age when almost all cloth dyes faded quickly with washing and sunlight, this was a big deal. Tyrian purple became the color of royalty, of high priesthood, of extreme wealth. The workshops of Sidon and Tyre, where the dye was produced, they were a smell you would not forget. Rotting shellfish, boiled in vats on an industrial scale for weeks at a time. The mounds of discarded murex shells outside these cities were so enormous that some of them are still visible today, thousands of years later. The scale of the murex industry is genuinely difficult to grasp until you look at the numbers. Modern experiments suggest that it took something like 8 or 9,000 snails to produce a single gram of the concentrated dye. A single royal robe, the kind that a Persian king or a Roman senator might wear, might require the sacrifice of 250,000 of these creatures. And the Phoenicians were producing this stuff by the ton. For centuries. The mounds of shells I mentioned at the end of the last section, they aren't small. Some of them are the size of small hills, layer upon layer of crushed, discarded murex accumulated over generations of dye-making. The stench must have been formidable. The Roman writer Pliny, writing centuries later, described the smell of the dye workshops as fetid, which is a diplomatic way of putting it. The workers who processed the snails, breaking the shells, extracting the small gland that held the precursor to the dye, boiling the extract in lead vats for days, they lived and worked in a permanent atmosphere of decay. And yet the finished product was worth its weight in silver. Literally. There are ancient sources that give exchange rates, and Tyrian purple cloth was one of the most expensive commodities in the entire ancient world. But purple was only one of the things that made these cities wealthy. There was also, as I mentioned earlier, the cedar. And here again, geography played its role. The Lebanon mountains, which cut the coast off from the interior, were covered in the classical period with vast forests of the cedar of Lebanon, Cedrus libani, a tree that grows tall and straight and produces timber that is, it's exceptional by ancient standards. It's rot-resistant. It's aromatic, which means it repels insects. It's easy to work but strong. And it grows to enormous sizes, individual trees reaching well over 100 feet in height, with trunks several feet in diameter. For any civilization that needed serious construction lumber, cedar of Lebanon was the gold standard. And in the ancient Mediterranean, virtually every civilization that mattered needed it. The Egyptians had been importing cedar from Byblos, as I mentioned, since the 3rd millennium BC. The tomb of King Khufu at Giza, the Great Pyramid, contained a dismantled cedar boat that had been buried beside it, 60 feet of Lebanese timber that had been shipped from Byblos to Egypt in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. Egyptian temples were roofed with cedar beams. Egyptian royal barges, the ceremonial boats that carried pharaohs on the Nile, were built of Lebanese cedar. The trade was so continuous, so central to the Egyptian relationship with the Levant, that Byblos itself acquired an Egyptianized character. Its kings adopted Egyptian titles. Its temples borrowed Egyptian architectural motifs. Its writing system used Egyptian conventions. A visitor to Byblos in the 2nd millennium BC might have been forgiven for thinking they'd wandered into an Egyptian provincial capital rather than a Canaanite city-state. Now the Egyptians weren't the only customers. Mesopotamian kings sent expeditions to acquire Lebanese cedar. The Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, described in some detail in the biblical Book of Kings, was built with cedar supplied by Hiram, the king of Tyre, in exchange for grain and olive oil and other Israelite commodities. And this arrangement, this specific trade relationship between Tyre and Jerusalem in the 10th century BC, gives us one of the clearer windows into how the Phoenician commercial system actually worked. The Phoenicians didn't grow their own food, or not enough of it. Their coastal strip was too narrow, too rocky, too devoted to other purposes. They imported grain from Egypt and from the interior kingdoms. They imported olive oil when they weren't producing enough themselves. They paid for it mostly with cedar and with dye and with the manufactured goods that their workshops produced. It was a fundamentally commercial economy, dependent on continuous exchange, and that dependence shaped everything about them. There was glass, too. The Phoenicians didn't invent glassmaking. That distinction belongs to somebody else, probably in Mesopotamia or Egypt, sometime in the 3rd millennium BC. But the Phoenicians took the technology and did something new with it. They developed methods for producing clear glass, then colored glass, then glass in molds that could be cast into vessels and beads and decorative objects at what for the ancient world counted as an industrial scale. The sands along the coast of the Levant, particularly around the mouth of the river Belus just south of Tyre, were exceptionally pure, which meant they produced exceptionally clear glass. The Roman writer Pliny, who's actually one of our best sources for a lot of this stuff, credits the Phoenicians with the accidental discovery of glass, describing an origin story in which merchants camping on the beach used blocks of natron, which is sodium carbonate, to prop up their cooking pots. The natron, mixed with the sand and heated by the fire, fused into glass. It's almost certainly a legend, but the association of the Phoenicians with the innovation of glass production is not a legend, and their glassware ended up in aristocratic households across the Mediterranean. And then there were the metals. This is really where the story gets interesting from the perspective of the wider ancient world. Because the Phoenicians, in developing their maritime trading network, were essentially building the world's first long-distance commodity supply chain for raw metals. Copper from Cyprus, that was straightforward. Cyprus was close, and the trade was ancient. But as the demand for bronze grew, and later the demand for iron, and as the sources for tin and silver became more difficult to reach, the Phoenicians pushed further and further west. Sardinia had copper. The Iberian Peninsula had silver in extraordinary quantities. And then there was tin. Tin was rare. Tin was hard to find. Tin was essential for making bronze. And the largest known deposits of tin in the ancient Western world were in Cornwall, at the very southwestern tip of the island of Britain. The Phoenicians got there. We know this. There are ancient references to the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands, which is what Greek geographers called the tin-producing regions somewhere in the far west that the Phoenicians visited but wouldn't tell them about. The Phoenicians guarded their trade routes fiercely, and part of their commercial strategy involved simply not telling anyone else where the good stuff came from. The story is told by the Greek historian Strabo of a Phoenician sea captain who deliberately wrecked his ship rather than let a Roman vessel follow him to the Tin Islands. Whether that particular story is true or not, the general attitude it reflects certainly was. Phoenician sailing directions, the practical knowledge of how to reach specific ports and how to conduct trade there, were state secrets. They were the accumulated intellectual property of centuries of navigation, and they were what gave the cities their competitive edge over any potential rival. Which brings us to the ships themselves, because you can't understand the Phoenicians without understanding their vessels. And here again, they were the pioneers. The specific design that the Phoenicians developed for their long-distance trading ships was something they called, and forgive the pronunciation, the gorlos, from a Semitic root meaning something like round or tub. These were broad-beamed vessels with high sides, single-masted, square-rigged, and built for cargo capacity rather than speed. A typical Phoenician merchantman might be 60 or 70 feet long and capable of carrying 20 or 30 tons of goods. Which doesn't sound like much by modern standards, but by the standards of the ancient world it was serious. These ships could make voyages of hundreds of miles, could carry crews of 15 or 20 men, and could sustain themselves for weeks at sea. They had steering oars at the stern, they had rope rigging, they had leather sails, and in some cases they had ram-like extensions at the bow that helped them cut through the water more efficiently. For military purposes, the Phoenicians developed a different ship, the biremes and later triremes, warships with multiple banks of oars that could move at high speed and were designed for combat. These vessels were faster, sleeker, and much lower in cargo capacity, and they served as escorts for the merchant fleets and as the naval component of Phoenician city defense. The trireme, in fact, may have been a Phoenician invention. The specific arrangement of 3 banks of rowers, stacked on top of each other on a narrow hull, was a genuinely innovative solution to the problem of packing more oar power into a hull without making the ship too long to maneuver. The Greeks later adopted the trireme and made it their own, but the origins of the design point back to Phoenician shipyards, probably at Sidon or Tyre in the 8th or 7th century BC. The Phoenician sailors themselves were, by ancient standards, extraordinary. They were the first Mediterranean people to sail routinely out of sight of land, using the stars for navigation. The specific star they preferred, the North Star of the ancient world, was Beta Ursae Minoris, which the Greeks called the Phoenician star because of its association with Phoenician navigation. They developed the practice of celestial navigation to a degree of sophistication that would not be matched again in the Mediterranean until the Renaissance. They kept careful records of coastlines, of prevailing winds, of currents, of safe anchorages. And they were, so far as we can tell, the first sailors in the Western world to make routine multi-day voyages out of sight of land, cutting straight across the Mediterranean rather than hugging the coast the way earlier sailors had done. The Phoenician year, incidentally, was structured around the sailing season. From roughly April to October, the Mediterranean is relatively benign for shipping. The winds are predictable, the storms are relatively few, the days are long. From October to April, on the other hand, the Mediterranean turns hostile. Winter storms are frequent and dangerous. Visibility drops. The Phoenicians, for the most part, didn't sail in winter. They laid up their ships, they conducted their local business, they repaired equipment, and they waited. And when spring came, the entire commercial life of the Phoenician cities burst back into activity. Ships were caulked and re-rigged. Crews were assembled. Cargoes were loaded. And the fleets went out in flotillas of dozens of vessels bound for Cyprus, for Egypt, for the Aegean, for the Western Mediterranean. The rhythm of the sea determined the rhythm of the city, and the city adapted itself entirely to the demands of the maritime trade that made it wealthy. Now, all of this commercial activity, this long-distance trade in cedar and dye and glass and metals, generated a specific administrative problem that turned out to be one of the most consequential problems in the history of writing. And that problem is what we'll get to next. The problem, put simply, was writing, or rather, the lack of a good system for it. Because if you were running a Phoenician trading house in, say, the 11th century BC, and your ships were coming and going from a dozen ports around the Mediterranean, and you had contracts with suppliers in Cyprus and buyers in Egypt and agents scattered across the Aegean, well, you needed to keep records. You needed to track what was owed and what was paid. You needed to send instructions to a captain who was going to be at sea for weeks. You needed to communicate with people in distant cities whose local dialects might differ from yours, but whose commercial needs matched yours exactly. And the writing systems available to you at that moment in history were, to put it delicately, not really up to the job. The two great writing traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean in this period were Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform. Both were staggeringly complex systems. Egyptian hieroglyphs used somewhere between 700 and 1,000 distinct signs, each of which could function in multiple ways, some as pictures representing specific objects, some as phonetic signs representing sounds, some as determinatives indicating what category of word was being written. Learning to read and write hieroglyphs took years of dedicated study, and even the educated Egyptian elite typically employed professional scribes rather than write themselves. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system used across Mesopotamia and beyond, was similarly complex, with hundreds of signs and a mix of logographic and syllabic uses that varied by language and region. These systems worked, obviously. They worked well enough to run the great empires of the ancient Near East for millennia, but they had a specific problem from the perspective of a trading civilization. They required a specialist class of scribes to operate. The literate portion of the population in Egypt or Mesopotamia was probably somewhere between 1% and 5%, and the training required to join that literate elite was so extensive that literacy was, in effect, a hereditary profession. Scribes trained their sons, sometimes their daughters, and the knowledge circulated within a small caste of professional writers. For a Phoenician merchant, this meant that any correspondence, any contract, any record keeping had to be filtered through professional scribes, who cost money, who had their own agendas and whose availability was never guaranteed when you needed them. Now the Phoenicians did not invent the idea of alphabetic writing out of nothing. Nobody ever really does. The specific innovation had precedence, and the intellectual history of the alphabet takes us back a few hundred years before the classical Phoenician period. Sometime around the 19th or 18th century BC, in the Sinai Peninsula or nearby, some enterprising person or persons, quite possibly Canaanite laborers working in Egyptian turquoise mines, developed a proto-alphabetic script by taking Egyptian hieroglyphs and using them to represent not the objects they showed, but the initial sounds of the Canaanite words for those objects. So a hieroglyph that showed the head of an ox, the Egyptian word for which had no relation to anything alphabetic, was repurposed to represent the sound of the Canaanite word for ox, which begins with a glottal stop that we might Romanize as an aleph. A hieroglyph showing a house was repurposed to represent the bet sound from the Canaanite word for house, and so on. This system, which scholars call the Proto-Sinaitic script, appears in a few dozen surviving inscriptions, mostly from turquoise mining sites at Serabit El Khadim in the Sinai, and from some sites in Canaan proper. It's a genuinely crude script by the standards of what came later. The letter forms are variable. The system isn't fully standardized, and it seems to have been used only sporadically, mostly for short inscriptions like graffiti or dedications. But the crucial conceptual leap had been made. The idea that a script could work by having each sign represent a single consonantal sound, rather than a word or a syllable, was now out there in the world. And over the next several centuries, that idea evolved and matured in the Canaanite-speaking regions of the Levant. By the 11th century BC, in the workshops and counting houses of Byblos and the other Phoenician cities, this proto-alphabetic system had crystallized into what we now recognize as the Phoenician alphabet. 22 letters, each one representing a single consonantal sound, written from right to left. Simple enough in its forms that they could be scratched onto pottery, incised into stone, painted on papyrus, or carved into wood by anyone who took the time to learn the 22 signs. And the profound implication of this system, the thing that would change the world, was that literacy no longer required a specialist class. A merchant could learn to read and write in weeks rather than years. A ship's captain could keep his own accounts. A traveling agent could send letters that didn't need to be dictated to a scribe. And over generations, literacy could seep out of the palace and temple and become something closer to a general skill of the commercial classes. The earliest reasonably datable Phoenician inscriptions we have come from around 1000 BC. The most famous is the sarcophagus of King Ahiram of Byblos, discovered in the early 20th century and inscribed with a Phoenician text that curses anyone who would disturb the tomb. It's a relatively short inscription, but it's fully alphabetic, fully standardized, and executed with a confidence that suggests the writing system had been in use for some considerable time, already before Ahiram's craftsmen carved his sarcophagus. From this point on, Phoenician alphabetic inscriptions become more numerous, appearing on stone monuments, on pottery, on metalwork, and eventually on papyrus, though of course papyrus rarely survives in the Levantan climate, which is one reason we know less about Phoenician literary and administrative culture than we would like. The specific letter forms of the Phoenician alphabet retained, in a stylized way, their pictographic ancestry. Aleph, the first letter, was still recognizably the head of an ox, tilted on its side, with two curving horns. Bet, the second letter, was a simple diagram of a house, a rectangle with a triangular roof. Gimel, the third letter, may have derived from a camel's neck. Dalet, the fourth, from a door, and so on through the sequence. Now these origins were probably not visible to most Phoenician users of the script, any more than a modern user of the letter A thinks about the ox that the Aleph originally depicted. The letters had become abstract signs whose meaning was purely phonetic, but the ancestral shapes remained, and they would be transmitted, with modifications, to every alphabet that descended from Phoenician. And there were many. This is really where the historical significance of the Phoenician alphabet becomes almost impossible to overstate. Because from about the 10th century BC onward, the Phoenician script began to spread to the peoples with whom the Phoenicians traded. The Greeks, who had lost their earlier Mycenaean writing system, Linear B, in the Bronze Age collapse, and had spent centuries without literacy, encountered the Phoenician script through their commercial contacts with Phoenician merchants in the 8th century BC. They took it, and they made one crucial modification. The Phoenician alphabet had no vowels. Being a Semitic language, Phoenician could function as a written language with only consonants indicated, because Semitic grammar makes the vowels of a word substantially predictable from context. But Greek, being an Indo-European language, needed vowels to be intelligible. So the Greeks took some Phoenician letters that represented consonants that didn't exist in Greek and repurposed them as vowels. Aleph became alpha, the vowel A he became epsilon, the vowel EJ became iota, the vowel I ein became omicron, the vowel O, and with that adaptation, the first fully phonetic writing system in human history was born, one that could represent any sound in a spoken language. From Greek, the alphabet passed to the Etruscans in Italy, and from the Etruscans to the Romans, who developed it into the Latin alphabet that you're reading these words in right now. It also passed, through other routes, to the Arameans in Syria, whose alphabet evolved into the Hebrew and Arabic scripts, and through further transmission into the scripts of India and Central Asia, and eventually much of the writing systems of the modern world. Every alphabet in use today, from the Cyrillic of Russia to the Devanagari of Hindi to the Roman letters of English, ultimately descends from those 22 signs that Phoenician merchants developed to keep track of their cargoes. Now, the specific consequences of this development for the Phoenicians themselves were in some ways less dramatic than you might expect. The Phoenicians didn't build a great literary culture out of their alphabet, or if they did, we've lost virtually all of it. There's no Phoenician equivalent of Homer, no surviving Phoenician epic or drama or philosophical treatise. The materials on which they wrote, papyrus and wooden tablets primarily, don't survive in the wet coastal climate of Lebanon. The great libraries of Tyre and Sidon, if such things existed, have vanished entirely. What we have of Phoenician writing is almost entirely inscriptional, brief texts on stone or metal, mostly funerary or dedicatory in nature. The vast majority of what the Phoenicians actually wrote is simply gone. But the alphabet itself, the tool they created, escaped them and spread across the world. And the fact that we can barely read the Phoenicians in their own words is one of the great ironies of history. They gave us the means to record everything, and we've lost most of what they recorded. What we know about them, we know mostly through what the Greeks and Romans wrote about them, through what the Egyptian and Assyrian records mention about them, through the biblical accounts of their kings and traders, and through archaeology. The Phoenicians themselves, in their own voice, come to us in fragments. A dedicatory inscription here, a funerary curse there, a scrap of a trade contract on a broken piece of pottery. The specific relationship between the Phoenician cities and their more powerful neighbors is one of the more interesting stories in ancient Near Eastern history, because it shows, over and over again, how a small commercial civilization managed to preserve its independence, or at least a workable version of it, in a region dominated by successive imperial powers. The Phoenicians had no interest in military conquest. They had no ambition to build a territorial empire. What they wanted was to keep trading, and to keep the ports and the routes open, and to make money. And they discovered, early on, that the best way to do all of that was to make themselves indispensable to whichever imperial power happened to be dominant in the region at any given time. This wasn't quite subservience, though it sometimes looked like it from the outside. It was more like a kind of accommodation, a pragmatic recognition that the great powers of the age, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, all needed the goods and services that the Phoenicians could provide, and that as long as the Phoenicians paid their tribute and provided their ships when asked, they could largely be left to run their own affairs. The Phoenician city-states retained their own kings, their own laws, their own religious practices, their own commercial networks, throughout centuries of formal subjugation to one great power after another. It was a survival strategy that worked, for the most part, for close to 800 years. The first major imperial power to bring the Phoenician cities under its heel was Assyria. And Assyria is not a name that generates warm feelings in the ancient historical record. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, which rose to dominance in the 9th and 8th centuries BC, was one of the most militarized and brutally efficient conquest states in the history of the ancient world. Assyrian kings prided themselves on the terror they inflicted on their enemies, and the surviving Assyrian records go into rather uncomfortable detail about the specific methods used to punish cities that resisted or rebelled. Flayings, impalings, mass deportations of entire populations. The Assyrians did all of these things systematically and left extensive documentation of having done them. The Phoenician cities came into the Assyrian orbit gradually. In the mid-9th century BC, King Ashurnasirpal II campaigned into Syria and received tribute from the coastal cities. His son Shalmaneser III did the same. The Phoenician kings paid in gold and silver and cedar and manufactured goods, and in return they were allowed to continue running their trading operations. This was, in Assyrian terms, quite a light touch. The Assyrians could have simply invaded and destroyed these cities, but they recognized that the Phoenicians were more valuable as ongoing tribute payers than as conquered ruins. So the arrangement was one of client kingship. The Phoenician kings retained their thrones, and in exchange, they sent regular tribute to Nineveh and provided ships and sailors when the Assyrian king demanded them. This arrangement held mostly through the 8th and early 7th centuries BC. There were incidents, obviously. Individual cities occasionally decided that the tribute was too heavy or that a moment of Assyrian weakness offered an opportunity for independence, and in each such case, the Assyrians responded with characteristic thoroughness. Sidon revolted against Sennacherib in 701 BC and was punished severely, its king Luli fleeing to Cyprus where he died in exile. Later, under Esarhaddon in the 670s BC, Sidon revolted again, and this time the punishment was even more comprehensive. The city was sacked. Its walls were pulled down. Its king Abdi-Mulkati was captured and beheaded, his head being sent to Nineveh as a trophy. The population was deported en masse to Assyria, and a new Assyrian-controlled settlement called Kar Esarhaddon was founded on the ruins to replace what had been Sidon. This was Assyrian imperial administration in its most brutal form, and it made an impression on the other Phoenician cities that lasted for a long time. Tyre, meanwhile, had a rather different relationship with Assyria. Tyre was, at this point, the wealthiest and most powerful of the Phoenician cities, and its specific geography made it uniquely difficult to conquer. The original city of Tyre was located on the mainland, but the Tyrians had, at some point in the 2nd millennium BC, expanded their settlement to an offshore island about half a mile from the coast. By the 7th century BC, the island city had become the main center of Tyrian population, commerce, and government. And an island city, obviously, could not be conquered by conventional siege warfare. You couldn't tunnel under the walls if the walls were surrounded by water. You couldn't bring siege engines against gates that opened onto the sea. And Tyre, with its excellent harbors and its enormous fleet, could keep itself supplied indefinitely by ship, even when its mainland territory was overrun. This made Tyre effectively unconquerable by the standards of ancient warfare, and it made the city's rulers considerably more willing to test the limits of Assyrian tolerance than their less strategically situated colleagues in Sidon or Byblos. The Tyrian king Baal I, who ruled during the reign of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon in the early 7th century BC, actually signed a formal treaty with the Assyrians that survives in fragmentary form. It's an interesting document because it shows the specific terms under which the arrangement operated. Baal agreed to pay tribute, to provide ships when requested, to allow Assyrian officials access to Tyrian markets, and to accept Assyrian oversight of certain aspects of Tyrian foreign policy. In exchange, Baal retained his throne, his city retained its autonomy, and Tyrian merchants retained their protected access to the Assyrian Empire and its trade networks. It was, as these things go, a workable deal for both sides, and it held more or less for decades. The specific commercial arrangements that developed under Assyrian overlordship were, if anything, favorable to Phoenician trade, because the Assyrian Empire had unified an enormous territory under a single administration. from Iran in the east to the Mediterranean in the west, and eventually including Egypt in the south. The Phoenician merchants who had privileged access to that market were in an extraordinary position. They could source silver from Anatolia and Iberia. They could sell manufactured goods across a vast market that had been secured by Assyrian arms, and they could take advantage of the peace that Assyrian hegemony imposed on the trade routes of the ancient Near East. Assyrian brutality was terrifying for the peoples in the empire's direct path, but it was actually quite beneficial for the coastal merchants who supplied the empire's demand for luxury goods and long-distance trade services. This is a pattern that recurs throughout Phoenician history. Every time a new imperial power rose in the region, the Phoenician cities adapted, paid their tribute, and continued their commercial operations, often benefiting from the imperial protection of their trade routes. When Assyria fell in the late 7th century BC, destroyed by an alliance of Medes and Babylonians and Egyptians, the Phoenicians simply shifted their tribute to the new Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II. When Babylon fell to Cyrus the Persian in 539 BC, they shifted again, and this time the arrangement was even more favorable. The Persians, who had no naval tradition of their own, needed the Phoenician fleet for their own military projects, and the Phoenician cities became, in effect, the naval arm of the Persian Empire. In exchange for providing ships and sailors, the Phoenicians received privileged status within the Persian imperial system, and a degree of autonomy that was probably greater than anything they had enjoyed under Assyrian or Babylonian rule. But before we get to the Persian period, which is really the last great chapter of independent Phoenician history in the Levant, we need to talk about Tyre and the specific challenge that came from the Babylonians. Because Nebuchadnezzar II, the same Babylonian king who is famous in the biblical record for destroying Jerusalem and deporting the Judeans to Babylon, also spent 13 years, from 585 to 572 BC, besieging the island city of Tyre. 13 years. It's a staggering length of time for a siege in the ancient world, and it tells you something about both the determination of Nebuchadnezzar and the resilience of Tyre. The specific difficulties that Nebuchadnezzar faced were the same ones that had frustrated the Assyrians. Tyre was on an island. The Babylonian army was superb at land warfare, but it had no navy worth mentioning. So Nebuchadnezzar could occupy the mainland territories of Tyre. He could cut off the city's overland supply lines. He could destroy the mainland settlement that the Tyrians called Old Tyre. But he couldn't actually cross the water to attack the island. And the island, with its harbors and its fleet, could resupply itself by sea more or less indefinitely. The siege dragged on for over a decade. The Babylonian army camped on the mainland, watching the island from a distance. The Tyrians on the island continued their commercial operations, at reduced capacity, but not really at existential threat. Ships came and went. The murex snails continued to be processed into dye. The workshops of the island city continued to produce their goods. And Nebuchadnezzar, one of the most powerful monarchs of the ancient world, was reduced to a spectator, watching a city he couldn't reach. When the siege finally ended, in 572 BC, the outcome was, characteristically, a negotiated settlement rather than a conquest. The Tyrians agreed to accept Babylonian overlordship in name, to pay tribute, and to make certain concessions in their governance, including the acceptance of a Babylonian-approved king. In exchange, they retained their essential autonomy and their commercial network. Nebuchadnezzar could claim victory, and the Tyrians could claim survival, and both sides could return to something like normal life. The prophet Ezekiel, writing from Babylonian exile a few decades later, referred to the whole affair with a certain bitterness, noting that Nebuchadnezzar's army had labored mightily against Tyre and received rather little material reward for its efforts. While all of this imperial jockeying was happening on the eastern Mediterranean mainland, something rather remarkable was taking place on the far side of the sea. Because the Phoenicians, whose commercial expansion we tracked in the earlier sections, had not simply been visiting foreign ports and returning home. They had been founding settlements, permanent colonies. Little pieces of the Phoenician commercial world planted along the coasts of the western Mediterranean, in the places where trade was profitable, and where local conditions, allowed a permanent Phoenician presence to take root. And by the 8th and 7th centuries BC, these colonies had grown into a proper network of Phoenician cities scattered across a huge swath of the ancient world, from Cyprus in the east to the Atlantic coast of Iberia in the west. The specific process by which these colonies were founded is a subject of some scholarly debate, but the general pattern seems reasonably clear. A trading expedition from one of the mother cities, most often Tyre, but sometimes Sidon or one of the others, would visit a promising location, establish commercial relationships with the local population, and then, over the course of years or decades, plant a permanent settlement of Phoenician residents to manage the ongoing trade. These settlements were usually located on islands or on peninsulas or on some other defensible coastal position, close to sources of raw materials that were valuable back in the eastern Mediterranean and with good harbor facilities. They started small, sometimes very small, essentially just a few dozen Phoenician traders and their families and workers. But they grew. Some of them grew a great deal. The earliest Phoenician colonial settlements were probably on Cyprus, which is geographically close enough to the Levantan coast that it hardly counts as long-distance colonization. Kishon, on the southern coast of Cyprus, was founded as a Phoenician settlement sometime in the 9th century BC and grew into one of the more significant Phoenician cities of the eastern Mediterranean. But the really impressive colonization began further west. Along the coast of what is now Tunisia, in North Africa, the Phoenicians established a string of trading posts and settlements starting in the 9th century BC. On the island of Sicily, at Motia on the western coast, they founded a colony that would become an important commercial center. In Sardinia, at Nora and Sulci and other locations. In the Balearic Islands. Along the southern coast of Spain, at Gadia, which the Romans would later call Gads, and which is now the modern city of Cadiz. Even further west, on the Atlantic coast of Iberia, at Lixus in what is now Morocco, and at various points along the North African coast between these locations. But of all the Phoenician colonies, one would eventually become far more famous and far more consequential than any of the others, and that was Carthage. The traditional founding date of Carthage is 814 BC, and while some archaeological evidence suggests the actual founding may have been somewhat later, perhaps in the mid-8th century, the traditional date has enough legitimacy that we can use it as a reasonable approximation. The founding legend, preserved in various forms in Greek and Roman sources, and probably reflecting a genuine Phoenician tradition, involves a princess of Tyre named Elissa, whom the Romans called Dido. According to the story, Elissa was the sister of the Tyrian king Pygmalion, and she fled the city with a group of followers after Pygmalion murdered her husband. She sailed west, eventually arriving on the coast of what is now Tunisia, where she negotiated with the local Berber king for a piece of land to settle on. The king, in the classic style of trickster negotiations that ancient authors loved, offered her only as much land as could be covered by the hide of a single ox. Elissa cleverly cut the hide into thin strips and used them to encircle a substantial area of ground, which became the foundation of the new city. Whether any of this actually happened is impossible to say. The story has elements that feel more literary than historical. But it points to something that probably is true, which is that Carthage was founded as an offshoot of Tyre by a group of Tyrian colonists at a moment when internal politics in the mother city made emigration attractive. The name Carthage itself is Phoenician, Kart Hadasht, meaning new city, distinguishing it from Utica, an older Phoenician settlement nearby whose name meant old city. A new city it was. Founded on a peninsula that jutted out into the Gulf of Tunis, with a naturally defensible position and access to some of the best harbors on the North African coast, Carthage was well positioned to become a major commercial center. And within a few centuries of its founding, that's exactly what it did. The specific geography of Carthage's location deserves a moment of attention because it shaped everything about the city's subsequent development. The site was on a rocky promontory extending into the sea, protected by natural harbors on both sides and by the sea itself on three sides. The peninsula was connected to the mainland by a narrow isthmus that could be easily defended. Behind the city, The coastal plain of what is now Tunisia was reasonably fertile, capable of supporting agriculture and pasturage on a scale that most Phoenician cities in the Levant, with their narrow coastal strips, could not match. And the site was located roughly at the midpoint of the North-South Sea route between Sicily and North Africa, and at the midpoint of the East-West route between the Eastern and Western Mediterranean. Any ship crossing between these regions passed through waters that Carthage could dominate. The city grew rapidly. By the 6th century BC, Carthage had developed into a proper metropolis with a population that has been estimated at anywhere from a few tens of thousands to well over 100,000 at its peak. Its harbors were engineering marvels of the ancient world. The military harbor, in particular, was a circular pool with docking bays cut into its perimeter, capable of housing over 200 warships simultaneously, with a central island for command and control. The commercial harbor sat adjacent to it, a separate rectangular basin where merchant vessels could load and unload. The city itself was surrounded by massive walls, in some sections 13 meters thick, and the Acropolis at the highest point of the peninsula, the Biasa Hill, was crowned with temples and administrative buildings. This was not a colonial outpost anymore. This was a great city, and by the standards of the Western Mediterranean, it was probably the greatest city of its time. Culturally and religiously, Carthage retained its Phoenician character throughout its history. The Carthaginians worshipped Baal Hammon and Tanit as their chief deities, versions of gods that were worshipped across the Phoenician world with local variations. They spoke a form of Phoenician that scholars call Punic, which developed over centuries into a distinct but recognizably related dialect. Their political institutions preserved the general Phoenician pattern of oligarchic governance, with a council of elders and 2 annually elected magistrates called suffites, though the specific details evolved over time and diverged from the practices of the eastern mother cities. Their commercial ethics, their attitudes toward trade and wealth, their patterns of urban organization, all these carried the distinctive Phoenician stamp. But Carthage also developed characteristics that its mother city Tyre had never possessed. Because unlike Tyre, which was constrained by its narrow coastal geography and its position among great empires, Carthage had room to grow. It had a fertile hinterland that it could conquer and exploit. It had neighbors, the various Berber peoples of North Africa, who were less powerful than the Assyrians or Babylonians or Persians, and who could be dominated rather than accommodated. And it had opportunities for expansion across the Western Mediterranean that no Eastern Phoenician city had ever really contemplated. So over the course of the 6th and 5th centuries BC, Carthage transformed itself from a trading city into an imperial power. It expanded its territory in North Africa, subjugating the Berber tribes and creating a substantial agricultural hinterland. It extended its influence over the other Phoenician colonies of the Western Mediterranean, gradually pulling them into a Carthaginian sphere of influence that eventually became something like a Carthaginian empire. And it built up a military capacity, both naval and land-based, that made it the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean by the middle of the 5th century BC. The specific institutions that developed to govern this expanded Carthaginian world were interesting because they combined elements of Phoenician commercial oligarchy with elements of more traditional imperial administration. The city was governed, at least in its later period, by a complex system involving the 2 suffites as chief magistrates, a council of elders that seems to have numbered in the hundreds, various tribunals with judicial and administrative functions, and when circumstances required, popular assemblies. The Carthaginian upper class consisted of wealthy commercial and landowning families whose interests dominated the government, but there was some limited scope for popular participation, and the Greek writer Aristotle actually praised the Carthaginian constitution as one of the best designed political systems he had studied, comparing it favorably to Sparta and to the constitution of his own Athens. The Carthaginian military, unlike the militaries of most of its contemporaries, relied heavily on mercenaries. The Carthaginian citizen population was involved in commerce and manufacturing and agriculture, and the citizens who served in the military tended to be officers rather than rank-and-file soldiers. The infantry of Carthaginian armies was typically composed of Iberian, Gallic, Numidian, Balearic, and various other peoples hired for their fighting skills and paid in Carthaginian silver. This system had its advantages. It allowed Carthage to field large armies without having to draft its own commercial population. It gave the Carthaginians access to the best fighting techniques of various Mediterranean peoples. But it also had its disadvantages, and those would become tragically apparent later in Carthaginian history when a mercenary revolt in the 240s BC nearly destroyed the city entirely. The conflict that would define Carthaginian history and that would eventually destroy the city was of course the long series of wars with Rome. But before we get to that, we need to set the stage properly, because the Punic Wars didn't come out of nowhere. They were the product of a long, gradual build-up of tension between two rising powers whose spheres of interest increasingly overlapped in the central Mediterranean, and the specific tensions that would eventually explode into open warfare were focused, above all, on the island of Sicily. Sicily, to explain briefly, was the strategic pivot of the Western Mediterranean. It sat directly between Italy and North Africa, dominating the sea routes between them. It was fertile, populous, and rich, and it had, by the 5th century BC, been divided among several different populations. The eastern part of the island was dominated by Greek colonies, chief among them the great city of Syracuse. The western part of the island was dominated by Phoenician and Carthaginian colonies, chief among them Motia and later Lilybaeum. And the interior was inhabited by the older, indigenous populations of the island, the Sicels and the Sicanians and the Elymians. For centuries, the Greek cities of eastern Sicily and the Phoenician cities of western Sicily had coexisted in a kind of tense but functional balance, occasionally fighting brief wars but generally accepting the essential division of the island. Carthage, as it grew in power, took an increasingly proprietary interest in the Phoenician side of Sicily, treating it as a Carthaginian sphere of influence that it would defend against Greek encroachment. The most famous of these Carthaginian-Greek conflicts in Sicily was the Great War of 480 BC, which happened to coincide with the more famous war between the Persian Empire and the Greek mainland that produced the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis. According to some ancient sources, the two conflicts were coordinated, with the Persians and Carthaginians agreeing to simultaneous invasions of Greek territory in the east and west. The Carthaginian expedition into Sicily was defeated at the Battle of Himera by the combined forces of Syracuse and Acragas, on the same day, according to Herodotus, that the Greeks defeated the Persians at Salamis. Whether that coincidence is historically accurate or is a nice piece of ancient historiographical shaping is impossible to say, but the general contours of the conflict are well established. The Carthaginians lost badly at Himera. Their commander, Hamilcar, disappeared during the battle, and Carthaginian involvement in Sicily was significantly reduced for the following generation. But the Carthaginians came back. In the late 5th century, and throughout the 4th century BC, Carthage waged a series of wars with the Greek cities of Sicily, particularly with Syracuse under its various tyrants. These wars produced some memorable episodes. In 409 BC, a Carthaginian expedition under Hannibal Mago, no relation to the more famous later Hannibal, destroyed the Greek city of Selinus and sacked Himera in revenge for the earlier defeat. In 397 BC, the Syracusan tyrant Dionysius destroyed the Phoenician city of Motia in what one ancient source describes as a particularly brutal siege, using new military technologies, including the earliest known catapults in Western military history. Motia was leveled, and its refugees fled to nearby Lilybaeum, which the Carthaginians rebuilt as their new stronghold in western Sicily. The struggle for the island continued, on and off, for well over a century, without either side achieving decisive victory. And then, in the middle of the 3rd century BC, a new player entered the game: Rome, which had, over the previous few centuries, gradually consolidated its control over the Italian peninsula, subduing the Etruscans and the Latins and the Samnites and the Greek cities of southern Italy, and by the 260s BC had become the dominant power in Italy. Rome's expansion had brought it into contact with the Greek cities of southern Italy, and from there it was only a short step across the narrow Strait of Messina to Sicily itself. And once Rome became involved in Sicilian politics, conflict with Carthage was probably inevitable. The specific incident that triggered the First Punic War in 264 BC was a rather complicated affair involving a group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines, who had seized the city of Messina in northeastern Sicily and were being besieged by the Syracusans. The Mamertines appealed both to Rome and to Carthage for help, and both powers intervened, and once they had both intervened they found themselves on opposing sides of what quickly escalated into a general war for control of Sicily. The details of the war itself would take us much too far afield, but the essential facts were these. The war lasted 23 years. It was fought primarily at sea, which was an interesting reversal for the Romans, who had never been a naval power. Rome built its first proper navy specifically for this war, allegedly copying the design of a wrecked Carthaginian warship that had washed up on the Italian coast. And after enormous losses on both sides, including several catastrophic naval disasters that killed tens of thousands of sailors, Rome eventually prevailed. In 241 BC, the Carthaginians sued for peace, agreed to evacuate Sicily, and paid a substantial war indemnity. The immediate consequence of the First Punic War for Carthage was a financial catastrophe. The city had exhausted its treasury paying for the long war. It could not afford to pay off its mercenary armies that had fought in Sicily. And when those mercenaries returned to North Africa expecting their wages and were told there was no money, they revolted. The mercenary war that followed, from 241 to 238 BC, was probably the most dangerous moment in Carthaginian history up to that point. The mercenaries were joined by many of the subject peoples of Carthaginian North Africa, and for a time it looked like Carthage itself might fall. The city was besieged. Its rural territories were devastated, and only through the efforts of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, whom we'll meet again shortly, was the revolt eventually suppressed with a level of violence that shocked even ancient observers. The mercenary leaders who fell into Carthaginian hands were crucified. The rebellious African subjects were subjected to reprisals of extraordinary severity. The revolt was crushed, but the city that emerged from it was smaller, poorer, and considerably more defensive than the confident commercial empire that had existed before the Sicilian War. Also, during the Mercenary War, the Romans took the opportunity to seize Sardinia and Corsica from Carthaginian control, in violation of the treaty that had ended the First Punic War, but at a moment when the Carthaginians were in no position to resist. This was, from the Carthaginian perspective, a piece of straightforward Roman treachery, and it left a legacy of bitterness that would poison relations between the two powers for the following decades. Which brings us to the Barca family, and specifically to the general who did more than anyone else to prepare Carthage for a second round against Rome. Hamilcar Barca was one of the outstanding military figures of his generation. Having distinguished himself in the last years of the First Punic War and having led the suppression of the mercenary revolt, he emerged in the 230s BC as the dominant political figure in Carthage. His analysis of the strategic situation was clear-eyed. Carthage had lost the war with Rome because it had been unable to sustain a long naval conflict with the resources of a small commercial state facing a much larger territorial power. If Carthage were to survive as an independent great power, it would need to develop new sources of wealth and manpower, and it would need to build up a land army capable of taking the fight to Rome rather than merely defending Carthaginian possessions. And the place where all of this could be accomplished, in Hamilcar's judgment, was Iberia. Iberia, the peninsula we now call Spain and Portugal, had been within the Phoenician trading orbit since the earliest days of long-distance Phoenician commerce. The city of Gadea, founded by Tyre in the very early period, was the western terminus of the Phoenician trade routes, and Iberia was the source of much of the silver that had made the Phoenician commercial world function. But Iberia had never really been part of a Carthaginian territorial empire. It was a peripheral zone, dominated by various Iberian and Celtic tribes, with Phoenician trading posts along the coasts and modest Carthaginian influence in some regions. Hamilcar Barca proposed to change that. He would go to Iberia with an army. He would subjugate its populations. He would exploit its silver mines on a scale never before attempted. He would recruit its warlike populations as troops. And he would build, essentially, a new Carthaginian empire in the west that would eventually be strong enough to challenge Rome on its own terms. The Carthaginian government approved the plan, and in 237 BC, Hamilcar Barca sailed to Iberia with an army and began the systematic conquest of the peninsula. He was accompanied, according to the ancient sources, by his son Hannibal, who was at that point about 9 years old, and who, according to a famous story preserved in Livy and Polybius, was made to swear an oath at an altar in Carthage before their departure that he would be an eternal enemy of Rome. Whether the specific story is true or not, the general point is well attested. The Barca family carried a bitter grudge against Rome, and they raised their sons to inherit that grudge. For the next 9 years, until his death in battle in 228 BC, Hamilcar Barca conducted a systematic conquest of southern and southeastern Iberia. He subdued Iberian tribes. He exploited silver mines with a productivity that transformed Carthaginian finances. He built a new city, Acre Luke, near modern Alicante, to serve as his base of operations. And he raised armies of Iberian warriors, hardened by generations of tribal warfare, whose fighting skills would eventually be tested against Rome. After Hamilcar's death in a skirmish, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued the work, extending Carthaginian control still further and founding another new city, New Carthage, at modern Cartagena, which became the great Carthaginian capital of Iberia. And after Hasdrubal's assassination in 221 BC, the command in Iberia passed to Hamilcar's son Hannibal, who was by then 26 years old and had spent virtually his entire life on campaign in the Iberian Wars. Hannibal Barca, the son of Hamilcar, is one of those historical figures whose reputation has grown so enormous that it can be difficult to see the actual man underneath the legend. But he was, without question, one of the greatest military commanders in the history of the ancient world, and probably the greatest that the Phoenician civilization ever produced. His strategic vision, his tactical brilliance on the battlefield, his ability to inspire loyalty in a multinational army of Iberians and Numidians and Gauls and Africans and Balearic slingers, all of these were of a caliber that the ancient world had rarely seen. And when he inherited the command of Carthaginian Iberia in 221 BC at the age of 26, he inherited also his father's project of preparing Carthage for a second war with Rome. The only question was when to begin it. The immediate cause of the Second Punic War, when it came in 218 BC, was a dispute over the city of Saguntum on the eastern coast of Iberia. Saguntum was allied with Rome, but sat within what the Carthaginians considered their own sphere of influence in Iberia. Hannibal besieged the city, took it after 8 months of fighting, and thereby provoked Rome into declaring war. This was clearly what Hannibal had wanted. He had spent the preceding years preparing for exactly this conflict, and when the war finally came, his strategic response was one of the most audacious military plans ever conceived. Rather than wait for the Romans to invade Iberia, which was the obvious defensive move, Hannibal decided to take the war to Italy itself. He would lead an army from Iberia, across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, over the Alps, and into Italy from the north. Once in Italy, he would seek to detach Rome's Italian allies from their loyalty to Rome, thereby destroying the Roman power at its base. It was a plan that required extraordinary daring, extraordinary logistical capacity, and extraordinary confidence in his own ability to execute a campaign of unprecedented complexity in enemy territory. And in the spring of 218 BC, having left his brother Hasdrubal in command in Iberia, Hannibal set out from New Carthage at the head of an army that ancient sources put at somewhere between 40 and 60,000 men, along with a contingent of 37 war elephants. The crossing of the Alps in the autumn of 218 BC was the stuff of legend even in antiquity. The specific route Hannibal took has been debated by historians and by amateur mountaineers for over 2,000 years, and there's still no complete consensus. But whichever pass he actually used, the journey was catastrophic. The Alps in autumn are cold, windy, and dangerous, and Hannibal's army, which had come from the warmer climates of Iberia and North Africa, was not prepared for what it encountered. There were battles with hostile alpine tribes. There were avalanches. There were losses to cold and hunger and exhaustion. Ancient sources put the losses during the Alpine crossing at somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men, meaning that roughly half of Hannibal's army perished before he even reached Italy. The elephants, incredibly, mostly survived the crossing, though most of them would die during the following winter in the Po Valley. But Hannibal reached Italy. And once there, he began a campaign that would produce, over the next 3 years, some of the most devastating battlefield defeats ever inflicted on Rome. At the Trebia in December 218 BC, at Lake Trasimene in June 217 BC, and finally at Cannae in August 216 BC, Hannibal destroyed Roman armies of a size that Rome had never lost before. Cannae, in particular, was a tactical masterpiece. Hannibal, with an army of about 50,000, faced a Roman army of roughly 80,000 under the consuls Varro and Paulus. He deployed his center in a curved formation that yielded to the Roman advance, drawing the Roman infantry into a pocket, while his heavy cavalry on the wings routed the Roman cavalry and then swept around behind the Roman infantry to attack it from the rear. The result was one of the most complete tactical envelopments in military history. Roman losses at Cannae in a single day of fighting are estimated at around 50,000 killed and something like 10,000 captured. It was the worst defeat in Roman military history up to that point, and it should have ended the war. But it didn't. And this is one of the more remarkable facts about the Second Punic War, and one that tells you something important about the specific nature of Roman society and about the specific problems Hannibal faced. Because after Cannae, Rome did not surrender. Roman citizens did not rise up against their government. Rome's Italian allies did not, for the most part, defect to Hannibal. Some did. The Greek cities of southern Italy, some of the Samnite communities, the city of Capua, all did break with Rome and go over to the Carthaginian side. But most of Rome's allies stayed loyal. And Rome itself, drawing on manpower reserves that Hannibal had probably underestimated, simply raised new armies and continued the war. The Romans adopted a strategy of avoiding direct battle with Hannibal himself while attacking his allies and gradually wearing down his position in Italy. And over the course of the following years, this strategy worked. Hannibal remained in Italy for a total of 15 years, from 218 to 203 BC. He won more battles. He never lost a major engagement on Italian soil. But he could not force Rome to surrender, and he could not sustain his army indefinitely in enemy territory without reinforcements from home. And the Carthaginian government, for reasons that historians still argue about, never sent him the reinforcements he needed. When his brother Hasdrubal marched from Iberia with a second army to join him in 207 BC, that army was intercepted and destroyed at the Battle of the Metaurus, and Hasdrubal was killed. Hannibal received his brother's severed head thrown into his camp by Roman envoys as a message, and after that, the writing was on the wall. The final act of the war came in North Africa. In 204 BC, the Roman general Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus, landed in North Africa with an invasion force. Scipio had spent years studying Hannibal's tactics, and he was probably the only Roman commander of the period who was capable of meeting Hannibal on his own terms. His invasion of Africa forced the Carthaginian government to recall Hannibal from Italy, and in 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Hannibal fought his first major defeat. Zama was itself a remarkable battle. Scipio had allied with the Numidian king Massinissa, whose cavalry was of superb quality, and it was Massinissa's cavalry that gave Scipio the decisive advantage. Hannibal's army was destroyed. Hannibal himself survived and escaped, but the war was over. Carthage sued for peace, and the terms that Rome imposed were harsh. Carthage lost all its overseas possessions, including Iberia. It was forced to pay a massive war indemnity over 50 years. its fleet was reduced to a token force, and it was forbidden from wagging war without Roman permission. It was, essentially, the reduction of Carthage from a great power to a subordinate client state. Hannibal himself, remarkably, remained in Carthage and served as a suffete, one of the two chief magistrates of the city, in the years after the war. He tried to reform the Carthaginian financial system to make it possible to pay off the Roman indemnity more quickly. He fought against the entrenched corruption of the Carthaginian oligarchy, and he made enemies among the wealthy families whose interests he was threatening. In 195 BC, those enemies denounced him to the Romans, accusing him of plotting further war, and Hannibal fled Carthage rather than face what he knew would be Roman demands for his surrender. He spent the last 2 decades of his life in exile at various eastern courts, serving as a military advisor to various kings who were themselves at odds with Rome, and constantly being pursued by Roman diplomats demanding his extradition. Finally, in 183 BC, cornered at the court of King Prusias of Bithynia in what is now northern Turkey, and facing imminent handover to Roman agents, Hannibal took poison rather than be captured. He was 64 years old. Between the end of the Second Punic War and the beginning of the Third, half a century of relative peace prevailed. Carthage, reduced to its African territories and forbidden from major military activity, actually recovered economically during this period. The city's commercial networks, though diminished, still functioned. Its harbors were still busy. Its agriculture in the North African hinterland was still productive. By the 150s BC, Carthage had paid off its war indemnity in full and was showing signs of economic prosperity that alarmed observers in Rome. The Roman senator Cato the Elder, who had visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission in 153 BC and had been shocked by what he saw of the city's continued prosperity, developed an obsession with the idea that Carthage remained a threat to Rome that must be eliminated. Every speech he gave in the Senate, on whatever topic, ended with the same phrase: Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendum. Furthermore, I think that Carthage must be destroyed. Whether Cato genuinely believed that Carthage was a strategic threat to Rome, or whether he was pushing a policy that would benefit certain Roman commercial interests that competed with Carthaginian trade, or whether he was simply an old man with a grudge, has been debated ever since. But the policy he advocated eventually won out. In 149 BC, using a technicality involving a Carthaginian war with the Numidian king Massinissa as a pretext, Rome declared war on Carthage. The Third Punic War had begun, and this one, unlike the previous two, would not end with a negotiated settlement. This one would end with the systematic destruction of Carthage as a city and as a civilization. The Third Punic War is one of the more grim chapters in ancient military history, because it is essentially a story of a great city being methodically destroyed by an enemy that had decided the destruction should be total. There was no strategic necessity for what happened to Carthage in 149 to 146 BC. Carthage in the mid-2nd century BC was not a military threat to anyone. Its army was small, and its navy essentially non-existent. It had paid its indemnity, honored its treaty obligations, and posed no realistic danger to Roman interests in the Western Mediterranean. But Roman policy, driven by Cato and by the specific commercial and ideological interests that supported him, had decided that the city must be destroyed anyway. And once that decision was made, the technical challenge was simply the specific mechanism by which to accomplish the destruction. The Romans made their demands progressively more humiliating, hoping to provoke Carthaginian resistance that would provide a pretext for war. First, they demanded 300 hostages from among the noble families of the city, which the Carthaginians provided. Then they demanded that Carthage surrender all its weapons, which the Carthaginians also did, handing over stockpiles that ancient sources describe in remarkable detail, tens of thousands of shields and swords and catapults. Then, having disarmed the city, the Romans made their final demand. The Carthaginians were to abandon their city entirely, move 10 miles inland, and rebuild themselves as an inland community without access to the sea. This, of course, was impossible for a Carthaginian to accept. The city was Carthage. Its identity was maritime, commercial, coastal. To move inland was to cease to be Carthaginian in any meaningful sense. When this demand was announced, the Carthaginians did what the Romans had probably hoped they would do. They chose to resist rather than accept. The specific defense that Carthage mounted in the following 3 years is genuinely remarkable and constitutes one of the most impressive last stands in ancient military history. A city that had surrendered all its weapons had to arm itself from scratch. The Carthaginians turned every workshop into an armory. They stripped the columns of their temples for the timber and metal needed to build war machines. They cut off the hair of the women of the city to make bowstrings, according to a story that ancient sources present as literal fact. They armed slaves and gave them their freedom in exchange for service in the defense. They built new ships, using desperate improvisations, in a city whose harbors had been reduced to a shadow of their former capacity. And when the Roman army arrived and began its siege, they resisted with a ferocity that shocked even the Romans, who had not expected such determined resistance from what they had assumed was a soft commercial population that had lost its martial vigor. The Roman siege of Carthage lasted 3 years. The Romans had superior numbers, superior equipment, and complete control of the sea, which meant they could resupply themselves indefinitely while progressively strangling the food supply of the city. But the Carthaginians fought them off assault after assault, defending their walls with a courage that the Roman sources, even the ones that had every reason to demonize the Carthaginians, describe with grudging respect. The eventual Roman commander, Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of the Scipio who had defeated Hannibal at Zama 50 years earlier, was probably the most capable Roman general of his generation. Under his command, the siege was systematically tightened. The Romans built a great mole across the harbor entrance to prevent Carthaginian ships from breaking out. They constructed enormous siege towers. They gradually closed off every avenue by which the city might have been supplied or defended, and in the spring of 146 BC, they broke through the walls and entered the city. What followed took 6 days. 6 days of street by street, house by house fighting through a city that had been the greatest metropolis of the Western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians fought from every rooftop, every doorway, every alleyway. The Romans fought their way inward from the walls, block by block, killing anyone who resisted and burning buildings as they went. The specific descriptions in ancient sources, particularly in Appian's account which drew on the eyewitness testimony of the historian Polybius, who was present with Scipio, are among the more horrifying passages in ancient military literature. Fires spread through neighborhoods. Buildings collapsed with people trapped inside. Streets were choked with bodies. The Biasa, the citadel of the city, was the final stronghold, and when it finally fell after 6 days of continuous fighting, the remaining defenders, some 50,000 people according to the sources, surrendered and were sold into slavery. But even after the surrender, the destruction continued. Roman policy, made explicit by the Senate before the campaign began, was that Carthage itself must cease to exist, not just be defeated, not just be occupied, cease to exist. So Scipio's soldiers, over the following weeks, systematically demolished every building in the city. Every temple, every warehouse, every house, every wall, every fortification. The great harbors were filled in. The city was burned to the ground, and the ground itself was, according to a famous legend that is probably not historically accurate, but that captures the spirit of what was done, sown with salt to prevent anything from growing there again. Whether the salt part actually happened is doubtful, but the essential fact of the destruction is well documented. Carthage, one of the great cities of the ancient Mediterranean, ceased to exist in 146 BC. Its site remained largely abandoned for over a century, until Julius Caesar founded a Roman colony there in the 40s BC, and later, the Emperor Augustus made it the capital of the Roman province of Africa. But the Punic Carthage, the Phoenician daughter city that had risen to challenge Rome, was gone forever. Polybius, watching the burning of the city from a vantage point beside Scipio, records that Scipio himself, seeing what he had done, wept, and that he quoted a line from Homer, from the Iliad, about the eventual fall of Troy. There will come a day when sacred Troy shall perish and Priam and his people. Scipio understood, according to Polybius, that Rome itself would someday face what Carthage had just faced. Every civilization, no matter how great, would eventually be destroyed by something more powerful than itself. The specific meditation is uncharacteristically philosophical for a Roman commander, and it may reflect Polybius's own literary embellishment rather than what Scipio actually said. But whether historically accurate or not, it captures something important about the moment. A great civilization had just been destroyed, and even the man who had destroyed it could see that the same thing would happen to Rome someday. Now, while all of this was happening in the West, we should not lose sight of what had happened, meanwhile, to the Phoenician cities of the East, back on the Levantan coast, because the eastern Phoenician cities had followed a rather different trajectory. Under Persian rule, which had begun in the 6th century BC when Cyrus conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Phoenician cities had enjoyed a period of considerable prosperity. The Persians, as I mentioned earlier, needed the Phoenician fleet for their own military projects, and they treated the Phoenician kings with respect and gave them significant autonomy. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad were all recognized as autonomous city-states within the Persian imperial system, retaining their own kings and their own governance. The Persian coinage that circulated in the Phoenician cities from the 5th century BC onward was minted locally, and the specific issues of Sidonian and Tyrian coinage from this period give us glimpses into the local religious and political symbolism of the individual cities. But the eastern Phoenician cities, too, would eventually meet their nemesis. And the nemesis, when it came, was Alexander the Great. Alexander's invasion of the Persian Empire began in 334 BC. After his victory at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, Alexander moved south along the Levantan coast, and the Phoenician cities faced a choice. They could submit to Alexander and open their gates to his army, or they could resist. Byblos, Sidon, and Arwad all chose the pragmatic option and submitted without a fight. Their kings, calculating that resistance to Alexander was suicidal, opened their cities to the Macedonian army and received in return the confirmation of their thrones and the protection of their commercial interests. This was the classic Phoenician response to a new imperial power, and it had served them well through centuries of Assyrian and Babylonian and Persian rule. But Tyre chose differently. Tyre, whose island fortress had defied Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years and had never been successfully conquered by any of the great imperial powers of the Near East, decided to resist Alexander as well. The specific reasoning of the Tyrian government has been debated by historians. Some scholars have argued that the Tyrians were confident that their island city could not be taken, as it had proven impregnable to previous besiegers. Others have suggested that the Tyrians were hopping the Persian fleet, which was still substantial and included many Phoenician ships from other cities, would come to their relief. Still, others have proposed that the Tyrian government was under the influence of a specific political faction that opposed submission to Macedon for religious or ideological reasons. Whatever the specific motivation, the decision was made. When Alexander asked for permission to sacrifice at the great temple of Melkart in the island city, which was one of the holiest sites in the Phoenician religious world, the Tyrian government refused, offering him instead the option to sacrifice at an older temple on the mainland. This was, essentially, a diplomatic insult, and Alexander, whose response to diplomatic insults was well documented by that point in his career, took it as a declaration of resistance and began the siege. What followed was the Siege of Tyre in 332 BC, which lasted 7 months and which stands as one of the most extraordinary military operations in ancient history. The Siege of Tyre by Alexander the Great presented, at the outset, exactly the same strategic problem that had frustrated the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The city was on an island half a mile offshore, protected by water that no land army could cross without ships. And Alexander, at that moment in 332 BC, did not have a fleet of his own. He was a land general at the head of a Macedonian army whose specialty was infantry and cavalry warfare, and he faced a maritime opponent who could, in principle, ignore him indefinitely from the safety of a rock in the sea. Previous generals in this same situation had eventually given up and negotiated, but Alexander was not previous generals. Alexander had ambitions that would not permit him to accept the humiliation of failing to conquer a single city, and he had the imagination to conceive of a solution that no previous besieger had attempted. He would build a road to the island. He would connect Tyre to the mainland with a causeway, and having connected them, he would be able to bring his siege engines and his infantry directly against the walls of the island fortress. The specific engineering project that followed was staggering by ancient standards. Alexander's army began systematically demolishing the abandoned mainland settlement of Old Tyre, which the Tyrians had themselves largely evacuated, and using the stone and timber from those buildings to construct a mole extending from the shore toward the island. The mole was hundreds of feet wide and progressively extended out into the sea over the course of months. The Tyrians, initially incredulous that anyone would actually attempt this, watched from their walls as the causeway crept closer. Then, as the seriousness of the project became clear, they began sending ships out to harass the construction crews, showering the workers with arrows and firebrands, and eventually launching a fireship attack that burned a substantial portion of the completed mole and killed hundreds of Macedonian workers. Alexander responded by widening the mole and building enormous protective towers along its length, and by beginning the systematic construction of a fleet of his own, drawing on ships supplied by the other Phoenician cities that had submitted, and by the kings of Cyprus who had also gone over to the Macedonian side. By the summer of 332 BC, Alexander had approximately 200 ships and a nearly completed causeway. The Tyrians, whose own fleet was substantial but outnumbered, were now confined to their harbors and could no longer freely challenge the besiegers at sea. The final assault, when it came, was a combined operation of siege towers pushing forward along the completed causeway and naval attacks against the harbor walls of the island city. The Tyrians resisted with the desperation of a people who understood what would happen to them if their city fell. And what happened, when the walls were finally breached, was among the more brutal sackings recorded in Greek historical literature. Alexander's soldiers, furious at the length of the siege and the casualties they had taken, poured into the city and killed several thousand of its defenders. The survivors, estimated at around 30,000 people, were sold into slavery. The city itself was not entirely destroyed, but its Tyrian character was fundamentally disrupted. Alexander repopulated it with new settlers, established a Macedonian garrison, and continued his campaign south into Egypt. The fall of Tyre in 332 BC essentially marked the end of independent Phoenician political history in the Levant. The eastern Phoenician cities continued to exist and to function as commercial centers under Macedonian rule, and later under the rule of the successor kingdoms that emerged from the wars of Alexander's generals. Sidon in particular flourished under the early Seleucid and Ptolemaic periods, but they were no longer independent city-states with their own kings and their own foreign policies. They were provincial cities within larger Hellenistic empires, and over the course of the following centuries, from the late 4th century BC through the 1st century BC, the Phoenician cities of the Levant underwent a gradual process of Hellenization. Greek became the language of administration and elite culture. Greek religious and philosophical concepts merged with older Phoenician traditions. Greek architectural forms replaced older Phoenician styles. The local dialects continued to be spoken in the streets and the marketplaces, and Phoenician religious practices continued to be observed in modified forms. But the distinctive Phoenician civilization, the specific cultural complex that had produced the alphabet and the great commercial network and the colonies across the Mediterranean, gradually blended into the wider Hellenistic world that had emerged from Alexander's conquests. When the Romans absorbed the Levant in the 1st century BC, incorporating the region into their empire following the conquests of Pompey the Great, the Phoenician cities became Roman provincial cities. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and Berytus continued to be commercially significant places under Roman rule. Berytus, which is modern Beirut, actually rose to particular prominence in this period, and became the site of one of the most famous law schools of the Roman Empire, a training ground for the lawyers and administrators who ran the eastern provinces. Tyre continued to produce its famous purple dye and remained a wealthy commercial center. Sidon remained an important glass-making center. But the language of these cities gradually shifted from Phoenician to Aramaic and Greek and eventually Latin, and the distinct Phoenician identity gradually faded from active consciousness. By the 3rd or 4th century AD, few residents of these cities would have identified themselves as Phoenicians in any meaningful sense. They were Syrians or Romans, or eventually, after Christianization, Christians of various theological affiliations. The specific date at which we can say that Phoenician civilization ended is impossible to pin down, because the ending was gradual rather than sudden. The Punic language, the dialect that had been spoken at Carthage and its associated colonies, continued to be spoken in North Africa for several centuries after the destruction of Carthage itself. Saint Augustine, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD from his position as Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, refers to Punic still being spoken in the rural districts of North Africa in his own time. So even 600 years after the destruction of Carthage, some people were still speaking a form of the Phoenician language. But it was a rural, marginal language by that point. It was not the language of any state or any center of power. It was a dying tongue, and by the time of the Arab conquests of North Africa in the 7th century AD, it was probably entirely gone. Whatever remnants of Punic identity had survived in North Africa were subsumed under the successive waves of Latin, Christian, and eventually Arab Islamic culture that swept across the region. And in the Levant, the Phoenician cities gradually became Byzantine cities, then Islamic cities. Tyre, which had once been the wealthiest commercial center of the ancient Mediterranean, became, in the medieval period, one of many secondary port cities of the Levanten coast, occasionally significant in the wars between Crusaders and Muslims, but no longer the great international emporium of antiquity. Sidon and Byblos followed similar trajectories. The murex snails were no longer harvested for purple dye. The cedar forests of Lebanon, exploited for over 3,000 years by successive imperial powers, were reduced to a few remnant groves in the high mountains. The great harbors silted up. The commercial networks that had once knit the Mediterranean together under Phoenician management dissolved into local trade patterns dominated by other peoples and other cities. What remained, in the physical sense, of the Phoenician civilization was actually rather modest. The archaeology of the eastern Phoenician cities has been complicated by the fact that these were continuously inhabited places, and the medieval and modern towns of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos were built on top of and often out of the stones of their ancient predecessors. So a great deal of the ancient Phoenician material culture has been lost to progressive rebuilding across the centuries. The archaeology of Carthage is better preserved because the site was largely abandoned after the destruction of 146 BC, and the Roman city that replaced it was built somewhat off from the exact center of the Punic city. So excavations at Carthage have revealed much about the physical structure of the ancient Punic metropolis, including the extraordinary Tophet, the sanctuary where the specific religious practices of the Carthaginians left their most controversial archaeological evidence. Which brings us, briefly, to the Tophet, because we can't really talk about Phoenician religion without addressing the specific question of child sacrifice that hangs over the Carthaginian religious record. The ancient literary sources, both Greek and Roman, accuse the Carthaginians of ritual infant sacrifice on a systematic scale, particularly in times of political or military crisis. The specific accusations describe children, usually infants, being burned alive in offerings to the god Baal Hammon and the goddess Tanit, and the practice being conducted at specific sanctuaries with dedicated personnel and elaborate ceremonial procedures. For centuries, modern scholars debated whether these ancient accounts represented actual historical practices, or were, instead, hostile propaganda by enemies of Carthage, designed to justify the destruction of what was, after all, a rival commercial civilization. But the archaeology of the Tophet at Carthage, and of similar sites at other Phoenician colonies, including Motia and various sites in Sardinia and North Africa, has produced evidence that has, most scholars now believe, essentially confirmed the ancient accounts. The Tophet at Carthage is an area of the city that contains the remains of many thousands of small urns, buried beneath the ground and containing the cremated remains of infants and young children, along with occasional animal remains. The urns are marked with inscriptions that identify them as votive offerings to Baal Hammon and Tanit, using formulas that are essentially religious dedications and dated across a period of several centuries. The specific interpretation of what these deposits represent has been contested. Some scholars have argued that the Tophet was, essentially, a cemetery for infants who died of natural causes, and that the religious inscriptions represent the parents' commendations of their deceased children to the gods rather than actual sacrificial killings. But the accumulated weight of the archaeological evidence, combined with the consistency of the ancient literary accounts, has convinced most contemporary specialists that at least some proportion of the burials do, in fact, represent ritual sacrifices. The specific scale of the practice, whether it was routine or reserved for exceptional circumstances, and the specific religious and social meaning of the sacrifices to those who conducted them, remain matters of active scholarly debate. So what, then, do we make of the Phoenicians? A civilization that lasted 1,000 years, that reshaped the ancient Mediterranean, that gave the world the alphabet, that founded a city that nearly conquered Rome, and that then vanished so thoroughly that its own language has been reduced to a specialist academic subject, and its own descendants have forgotten they ever existed. It's a strange legacy, and thinking about it properly requires holding several things in mind at once. The first thing to hold in mind is the specific character of the civilization itself, because the Phoenicians were not, in any conventional sense, a state or an empire or a unified people. They were a scattering of independent commercial cities strung along a narrow coast, speaking a common language, sharing a common material culture, worshipping related gods, and cooperating loosely when it suited them, but pursuing their own individual interests most of the time. There was no Phoenician king, no Phoenician capital, no Phoenician army in the sense that we might speak of an Egyptian army or an Assyrian army. There were only Tyrians and Sidonians and Biblians and Arwadians, and later, Carthaginians and Gadatanians and Motians and dozens of others, each pursuing their own commercial interests within a broader shared cultural framework. This was a civilization that never really coalesced into a single political entity, and that fact both helped it survive for a very long time and helped ensure that it would eventually be absorbed rather than transformed. Without a central state to defend, there was nothing definitive for its enemies to conquer. But without a central state to preserve its identity, there was also nothing to hold the civilization together when the pressures of assimilation became strong enough. The second thing to hold in mind is the specific historical role that the Phoenicians played, which was the role of connectors. They were the intermediaries. They were the people who linked the Eastern Mediterranean to the Western Mediterranean, who connected the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia to the barbarian populations of Iberia and North Africa and southern France, who moved goods and ideas and technologies from where they were produced to where they were valued. In a world in which most people stayed close to where they had been born, the Phoenicians moved. They moved by sea. They moved constantly. They moved across distances that most of their contemporaries would have considered impossible, and they moved in numbers that made them, in effect, the circulatory system of the ancient Mediterranean world. And in the course of that movement, they carried with them things far more consequential than the murex dye and the cedar wood and the manufactured goods that were the ostensible cargoes of their ships. They carried ideas. They carried techniques. They carried the alphabet. They carried, in a very real sense, the connections that made the Mediterranean world a Mediterranean world rather than a set of isolated regional cultures. The third thing to hold in mind is what happened after them, because the alphabet, that specific gift, is really the thing that changes everything. The Greek adaptation of Phoenician letters in the 8th century BC produced, over the following centuries, the intellectual explosion that we call classical Greek civilization. Homer's epics, the philosophical writings of Plato and Aristotle, the historical works of Herodotus and Thucydides, the scientific speculations of the pre-Socratics, all of it depended on a writing system that could actually record spoken language accurately, and that was accessible enough that a general educated class could use it. And that writing system, as we've established, was Phoenician in origin. The Greeks contributed the vowels and made various modifications to the letter forms, but the fundamental innovation, the reduction of writing to a small set of phonetic signs that could be learned in weeks rather than years, was Phoenician. And the whole subsequent history of literacy in the Western world, and much of the world beyond, descends from that original Phoenician insight. There's a specific irony worth pausing on here. The Phoenicians themselves left almost no literature. Whatever epics or philosophical treatises or histories they may have written have been lost. We know they had them, because ancient sources mention them, and because the specific character of a highly literate commercial civilization, more or less, requires that they existed. But the papyrus on which such works would have been written does not survive in the wet climate of the Lebanese coast, and the wooden tablets that would have been used for other purposes have decayed, and the great libraries that Tyre and Sidon and Carthage must once have possessed have all been destroyed or dispersed. So the civilization that gave the world the tool by which literature could be preserved left almost no literature of its own that has come down to us. What we know about the Phoenicians, we know almost entirely from what other peoples wrote about them, using the alphabet that the Phoenicians invented. It's a genuinely poignant fact, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, this thought that the people who made all this possible have themselves been rendered nearly speechless by the very passage of time whose recording they made feasible. The fourth thing to hold in mind is the specific way the Phoenicians disappeared. Because it wasn't just conquest, though there was conquest. It wasn't just cultural assimilation, though there was assimilation. It was, in a very specific sense, the transformation of the ancient Mediterranean into a single interconnected world that eventually made distinct regional identities obsolete. The Phoenicians had spent 1,000 years building the commercial and cultural network that connected the Mediterranean. And once that network was fully built, and once the successive great powers of Rome and later the Byzantine and Islamic empires had absorbed the entire Mediterranean into unified political systems, there was no longer any specific role for a distinct Phoenician commercial civilization to play. The Phoenician cities became simply ports in a larger world that they themselves had helped to create. Their distinctiveness was absorbed into the general commercial culture of the Mediterranean, a culture that they had done more than any other single people to establish. In the very success of their historical mission, they made themselves unnecessary, and so they disappeared. Well, disappeared is perhaps not quite the right word, because there are, in various forms, echoes of the Phoenicians that persist into the modern world in ways that we don't always recognize. The Maronite Christians of Lebanon, whose ancient community traces its origins to the early Christian era in the Phoenician cities, have, in modern times, developed a strong sense of Phoenician descent as part of their community's identity. The specific historical accuracy of this identification is debated, and modern Lebanese identity is a complicated and contested thing that involves many different threads of ancestry and cultural memory. But the fact that there are, in the 21st century, people in Lebanon who think of themselves as descendants of the Phoenicians is itself a kind of legacy. In Tunisia, the memory of Carthage persists in various forms, including in the archaeological sites of the ancient city that are now a UNESCO World Heritage location and a major destination for cultural tourism. In Spain, the city of Cadiz still remembers its origins as Gadia and celebrates its status as one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. And in the letters you're reading right now, every A and B and C and D and so on, in modified forms across 3,000 years, the ghost of Phoenician script still shapes the way that literate human beings communicate with one another. The specific accomplishment of the Phoenicians, in the largest sense, was to demonstrate that a small, commercially oriented people without vast military resources or great territorial holdings, could nonetheless play a decisive role in shaping the history of a whole region. This is a lesson that the ancient world, dominated as it was by great territorial empires, found somewhat difficult to absorb. Greek and Roman writers, when they wrote about the Phoenicians, often struggled to make sense of a civilization that measured its power in terms of trade rather than in terms of conquest. And this was probably one of the reasons that the historical memory of the Phoenicians has always been somewhat marginalized in Western historical consciousness. The Phoenicians didn't fit the standard narrative of ancient history, which is a narrative of empires and battles and territorial expansion. They were something different. They were something that we might, if we squint, recognize as more familiar from our own experience of the modern world. A globalized commercial civilization that operated across enormous distances by ship, and that made its living by connecting producers and consumers rather than by exercising direct political control over subject populations. Whether that comparison holds up under closer inspection is a question I'll leave you to think about. There are important differences between ancient Phoenician commerce and modern global commerce, and it's easy to overstate the parallels. But there's at least a family resemblance, and the resemblance is one of the reasons that the Phoenicians remain interesting to think about, even after all these centuries during which their specific civilization has ceased to exist. They were, in their way, the first proof of a specific historical possibility that has since become one of the defining features of the modern world. Well, that just about brings us to the end of another one of these long histories. Thank you for making it this far. I know it was a lot to work through, 10 sections, an awful lot of names and dates and places, and I appreciate you sticking with it. It's a story I've wanted to tell for a while now, because the Phoenicians so rarely get their due in the standard histories of the ancient world. Everybody knows about the Egyptians. Everybody knows about the Greeks and the Romans. Very few people know much about the folks who invented the alphabet that made writing about all of those other civilizations possible in the first place. So, I don't know. I hope this went some way toward correcting that a little bit. They were a fascinating people, and their story is one that deserves to be more widely known than it is. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please do like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really does help push us out in the algorithm. And thank you to those of you who support the channel financially and keep us ad-free and sponsor-free, doing this the way it ought to be done. You know the thing. Anyway, see you next time. Good night and farewell.